Dr. Elise Gornish is a Cooperative Extension Specialist in Ecological Restoration at the University of Arizona. Her research focuses on addressing restoration strategies that mitigate effects of climate change and designing financially and logistically feasible restoration strategies. Elise, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So I'd love to start just by talking about what restoration is and how restoration happens. Could you talk about kind of the basics of restoration?
Yeah, sure. So the sort of boring, dried, but generally accepted term, definition for restoration is the process in assisting in the rehabilitation of an area that's been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. So basically, if something happens to an area, a fire goes through, overgrazing, years of drought, you put up a parking lot, and it destroys the habitat in some way, gets rid of the plants, modifies water flow, reduces soil organic material. Restoration is the process of trying to get it back to the state that it was before you damaged it or before damage occurred. And most people attempt to get exactly what was there. So exactly the same number and type of plants, exactly the same number and type of animals, and exactly the same processes that were occurring before.
So what does how does that happen? How do you go from something that's been damaged or destroyed to something that has recovered? What's that
Yeah,
look like?
it's not easy. So basically, first you want to make sure that that damaging thing has stopped, or you mitigate it or dilute it in some way. And then you look to the past. Maybe you have documentation of what was there in the past, or you look to an area that didn't get damaged, and you say, okay, I see this type of number of tree, this type of number of bird. Let's get this back to that. And so usually people focus on the plants because those are the things that are easier to buy and install. And so people will put plants back in, or they'll seed an area and they'll try to get the plants going, because plants are really important for revitalizing the soil and providing things that animals need, so they can also get the animals back. They are helpful in making water go where it needs to go. And so plants are usually the first thing that we do.
Awesome. What's kind of a typical timeline for restoration for getting it
Uh,
back to
that's a great
recovered?
question. So, in mesic or wet systems, you might have a fire and you can seed an area, and literally the next year you are almost back to where you needed to be. In dryland systems where I work, it takes a very, very long time. It takes a very long time because things grow so slowly, and things grow so slowly because there isn't that much water. And things can take a very long time because in dry areas, you might have a damaging event like a drought or a fire, and you have the immediate problem of you lose plants because they burn up or they die. But dry areas also take years to respond. So you might come to an area and say, okay, a fire came through here, we're just going to replant what was here before. But you might replant in year one, but the soil bacteria and fungi that are really important for moving water, for example, in the soil, might not be responding for 5 years. So it can take a very, very long time. And some people would say it's impossible actually to achieve, 100% successful restoration in dryland systems. And when we're talking very long time, we're talking like 25 to 50 years.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Well, you mentioned seeding a couple of times. I wonder if you could talk about the application of seed balls and what those are used for and when they're used.
Yeah, so a lot of people, particularly in really large areas that need to be restored, they'll do seeding because it's just not feasible to kind of install, large plants across thousands of acres, for example. So people will seed with the hope that seeds will germinate and then grow and everything's great. And maybe in wetter systems that happens, in dryland systems that doesn't happen very often. In fact, the recent reviews have suggested that in dryland systems, only about 7 to 11% of restoration projects are successful in any way. And the reason this happens is, imagine, you're out on a desert landscape, right? You throw out a whole bunch of seed. What's going to happen to that seed before it has a chance to germinate? It might blow away because grass seed is really light. It might move offsite if you get a bunch of rain and then the rain kind of moves offsite and flooding. It might get eaten by a granivore or some kind of insect or mammal that eats that eats seeds. Or it might, when rain comes in dryland systems, particularly after it hasn't rained in a while, each drop that hits the ground moves the soil a little bit, right? But imagine you have a monsoon event where you have hundreds of thousands of millions of billions of little drops hitting the ground and moving soil. What happens is actually you can have all that seed covered by this thin crust of soil that's been dislodged and moved from that water. What we've actually found is that those seeds will germinate because it's wet enough, but they can't actually penetrate that like small crust. So we've worked in projects where we see nothing, and then you go out and you like stamp on the crust and you could see all these dead little seedlings under it. It's really sad. So and actually seeds and seed-based restoration, the germination, so the movement of a seed to a plant, that's the process of germination. That's actually the hardest sort of hurdle that restoration practitioners have to get over. So how do you address that? Well, we can look at the past of what people have done. So people for a very, very long time have employed logistically simple technologies to try to enhance seed growth. And mostly this has been through agriculture. So since at least the 4th century BC, we have documentation from China, people have made what's called seed balls. So seed balls are essentially the process of taking seed and mixing it with a bunch of stuff to enhance germination. So really back in the day, it used to be a mix of seed, a little bit of dung from animals, maybe some blood or bones, mix it up, and you mix it into this ball, which is easy to make with your hand. You make thousands of them, you put them out on the landscape. Why do seed balls work? Well, the ball itself is weighed down, so the seed is less likely to blow away. Once the ball dries, you have seeds that are inside the ball, so they're less likely to be targeted by seed-eating things. They're protected inside the ball from the stress of the sun. So, if you throw out seed outside in the desert where it's 110 degrees up here, it can be 140 degrees by the soil surface. So those seeds, they're living things. They can die due to desiccation stress. So they're also protected in that seed ball from the sun. And then when rain comes, the rain sort of disintegrates the seed ball, and the seeds find themselves in this pile of organic material. That organic material can hold on to moisture for longer than usually the surrounding soil. And so the seeds are more likely to germinate. So we have taken this practice that's been practiced for a very, very long time, again, mostly for agriculture, and we're trying to employ it in the context of ecological restoration. So you can make seed balls, you can make them really big, you can make them really small, you can make them small enough so that they can be taken by drone, you can make them small enough so you can throw them off the back of horses. In the Amazon rainforest, they actually make seed balls, and they take dogs and they put saddlebags onto dogs, and they put the seed balls in the saddlebags and just have the dogs run in these degraded areas. And as they run, the seed balls sort of fall out of the saddlebags. So they're just randomly planting. So they're amazing, and they really protect the seed until enough rain comes that can disintegrate the structure, and then the seeds are more likely to be able to germinate. And then they have a little pile of the seed balls we make. We usually put in a little bit of soil, sometimes inoculants that should enhance growth, sometimes some carbon or compost, so things, organic material that should help that seedling grow once it actually germinates.
And does the application of seed balls scale well? Can you do this at a really large scale?
Yes, it scales really well. So the extra cost, because obviously you have to buy the seed, you have to buy the other products, everything's very, very inexpensive. So the extra cost that you're adding is basically minimal. And then you can make seeds. The Forest Service is using seed balls to seed via drones, like thousands of acres of Forest Service land. So they're really, really good for, they scale up really, really well. The issue is that they are round, so they do roll, particularly downhill. So on sloped areas, they're not the best because they will just move down slope. And if you have a very, very flat area, which is not common in the desert because you'll have, natural depressions and rocks and stuff. When you do get your first or second monsoon event, usually you get this very slow flooding event called sheet flow of movement. So you get a bunch of water and the soil can't take in all that water. So you get a lot of water on top of the soil and it moves slowly. So seed balls can move in that, just like regular seeds can. So what's really good is a good approach is to employ something called pitting, which actually across studies has been found to be probably the most successful thing you can do, or the best thing you can do for successful arid land restoration. And all pitting is exactly what it sounds like. You make pits or holes in the ground. They do not need to be very deep, but what they do is they capture, as things move around, both in water and in wind, those small pits, because they are just a little lower than soil surface. Seeds are going to fall in there, water is going to fall in there and stay in there, organic material. So in these pitted areas, you're going to get way more likely to have growth of plants. When it actually does rain, these areas hold water for just a little longer. So if you can cross seed balls and pits, seed balls are great because the seeds stay where they should be and they'll fall into the pits and then not move and then germinate.
Hmm.
Pitting is great, but it's also really, really hard to do on large. It's hard to scale up. And some people don't like pitting because it does release carbon into the atmosphere. It can bother the soil microbial communities and the arthropods that live in the soil. And it's labor intensive. It's very easy to do. You can do it with your hands. You could do it with a shovel, but it's labor intensive if you want to do them on large scales.
Hmm.
But it works.
Well, I also wanted to ask you about another thing I saw in your work, buffalo grass, and what
Yeah.
that is and why it's important.
Yeah, so non-native species suck. They're really bad. They're not just bad because they're ugly sometimes, but they're bad because they displace native plants, and often they can aggravate things we don't like. So for example, in the Sonoran Desert, buffalo grass, which is a non-native perennial grass that was brought here during the Dust Bowl era from South Africa, it's a very hardy grass, super drought tolerant, and it can feed cows. So that's why the US government moved it over. And it did its job very well, a little too well, because it is way expanded out where it was initially planted. So buffalo grass is not great because it grows way, way faster than most natives, so it can outcompete natives. But also buffalo grass has a lot of biomass. Okay, they're these really big, really leafy grasses. And if you think about the Sonoran Desert, for example, the Sonoran Desert, the natural way the desert looks is that there's a lot of patchiness. So there's bare ground, which is very common. There's rocks. Plants are small, or if they're big, they're really skinny. They have a lot of water in their vascular tissue. So what that means is that if a fire comes through an intact Sonoran Desert, it's never going to get too big or too out of control because it won't ever have that much to burn, right? There's a lot of bare patches that fire can't cross. And if it does burn a plant, a lot of the plants have a lot of moisture in their insides. Buffalo grass, the way it grows is it forms these, like, think about like a lawn, right? Lawns are really short, but they just grow continuously. So you can get buffalo grass, which can grow up to like 3 feet, and they just grow continuously like a lawn. And so what that does is it provides this constant fire fuel. So where you get buffalo grass, you can get fires that burn really hot because there's a lot of fuel. That's the buffalo grass, and they just continue because it just spreads all over the place. And so we're getting these fires that are destroying native habitats. They're destroying homes. They're killing people. The big fire in Hawaii was caused by buffalo grass. So it's really problematic. It's also problematic because it's very drought tolerant. So it's really tolerant to our conditions in the deserts, and particularly in drought conditions. And so there's been lots of things that people have tried to do to get rid of it. So we spray it, that kind of works. We pull it, that works a little less good. We can graze it, but there's buffalo grass growing in places that are really hard to get to or really steep or whatever. And so areas that it's harder to graze, harder to pull, even harder to spray. And so trying to figure out how to deal with buffalo grass, that has, by the way, a 12-year at least seed bank. So what that means is that you can get rid of an entire individual of buffalo grass, but every year, the buffalo grass, it's a grass, it makes seed, that seed falls to the ground. It hangs out in the soil. You can get rid of all that buffalo grass, and then you might have 12 years of seed that can every year germinate. So you got to go back to that place and pull out all the babies.
Wow.
So it's a really, really hard thing to get rid of. So my lab is really interested in trying to figure out ways to get rid of it that uses IPM. So IPM is integrated pest management. Basically, it just means that you're using multiple approaches in the same year at 2 different periods of time. And why that might be helpful. So maybe you spray buffalo grass at the beginning of the month, and then you spray it again at the end of the month. Okay, that you can kind of think of that as IPM because that's 2 different times, but usually you want to use 2 different approaches. And the reason for that is that you want to hit buffalo grass at different stages. So when you spray it, for example, all that spray, it's going to get on the adult and it's going to get on the leaves and hopefully kill the plant. but you've got a lot of little babies that are growing kind of under and around the plant that probably that herbicide isn't going to get to. So how do you get those babies? So a month later, maybe you come and you hand pull, or you graze, or you do something to try to control this different age cohort, right? And then you're going to be more likely to be able to control it. My lab's really interested in the use of native plants in weed management. And so one of the things that some people have tried, not so much for buffalo grass, but for other places, is seeding in natives after you spray. So if you go to an area and you, for example, pull out a whole bunch of buffalo grass and then walk away, what you've just done is created a lot of disturbance in the area. And Invasion Ecology 101 tells you if you disturb an area, you're going to have invasives. So maybe buffalo grass will come back even worse. Maybe a new invasive will come in. So the way you need to address that is having something else there that competes with your native plant. So what we're trying to do is test and recommend to people that when they spray or pull or whatever, then they immediately seed in with native seed of native plants that hopefully will germinate and grow and compete with the emerging buffalo grass for resources and reduce the likelihood that buffalo grass will come back, either from outside of the area or from that seed bank.
And are there native plants that have proved to be more competitive than others with buffalo
Yeah,
grass?
that's a great question. Yes. So far, buffalo grass is basically it's super competitive, and the reason for that is that it germinates super quickly and grows very quickly, and that's really all you need to dominate everything. Because if you germinate with like very little water and then you start growing, when more water comes, you're growing your root system and you're able to take up all those moisture resources while your neighbor is just emerging, right? So there are some native plants like Arizona cottontop and tanglehead that grow particularly, they germinate faster than our other natives and they grow pretty robustly. And once they're there, once they're established, which usually takes 3 to 5 years to form like an established like sod, it's really hard for them to go anywhere. So they really are good at competing. It's at those really early stages that things are important. And so far, buffalo grass does much better than most of our natives, but buffalo grass does change its growth strategy if you have natives around. And so it grows a little slower and it reduces its root growth. So if we have natives out there, even if they're not out competing buffalo grass, they are changing its growth so that it's less dominant in the future and might be easier to get rid of in subsequent control efforts.
And so the impact of that is you're less likely to have fires. You're there, all of the things you mentioned. There's just less of that because of the native plants being in the soil.
Yeah, so you might be less likely to have a fire, and if a fire does come in, that fire is less likely to be super severe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wanted to also talk to you about soil microbial communities. What are those and how do those fit into all of this?
Yeah. So soil microbial communities, for the most part, are really tiny things that grow in the soil. So that's bacteria and fungi for the most part. And bacteria and fungi are really important for the soil. They are, without them, nothing would be living, right? And they mostly live in the topsoil, which is like the first 5 centimeters of the soil. Okay. Very important. This is why erosion is such a problem. So what they do everything from helping plants to get water and nutrients. They are the things that are responsible for water to be able to move through soil and to sit in soil. Without soil microbial communities, water would hit soil and it wouldn't be able to really penetrate or move. So it would just like flow off the top and erode things. Soil microbial communities are really important for this thing we call soil health, which is this kind of catch-all phrase that really indicates soil being able to support a healthy ecosystem, okay? And so when you get severe damage to a habitat, when you get multiple years of drought, or you have a really severe fire, something like that, your soil microbial communities might be lost. Maybe not entirely, but the native ones, the ones that are really important for supporting native plants and for secreting this glue that keeps soil together so it can hold on to water, you might lose those things. And so even getting native plants to grow, you might not be able to facilitate the rehabilitation of the soil microbial communities as fast as you need to. And that's a problem because we don't really know how to do that. So there are some folks who are working at NAU, Matthew Bowker and his lab, they are looking at biological soil crusts. So imagine like soil microbial communities, but that live on top of the soil surface. And they do all kinds of really great stuff. They keep the soil from moving, they enhance organic material in the soil, they shade the soil surface, all this great stuff. So they are working on trying to develop these crusts, these soil crusts that can grow really quickly, and then you can put them out on landscapes that are degraded. Some other folks are thinking about sort of inoculants, so buying inoculants commercially. For the most part, that doesn't work very well because, first of all, most inoculants that you buy are not going to be native to here. And so it would be like putting a non-native plant out here. That's not good. Second, most inoculants are grown in a lab. And so you've got this nice lab environment that's warm and wet, and there's all this food. And then you take that thing and you put it out in 140-degree soils. It's going to die immediately. So what people have been doing forever is basically going to a healthy environment, scooping up the soil that, because the environment is intact and healthy, the microbial communities you need are in that soil, and then putting it into the degraded area. So for example, you want to put in a tree into a degraded area, you take a little bit of that healthy soil and you put it into the hole where you put the tree. We know this works. The challenge is that there is almost no research at all that would suggest like how it works. Basically, I can tell the story and then someone's like, okay, how much soil do I need to move? I have an acre that was burned. How much soil do I need to move? And I'm like, I don't know. Nobody knows how much soil, how you put it down, how it expands out from wherever you put it in, what you need to do to make sure that the things in that soil survive. Can you just put it right down on the top? Do you have to dig a hole? I mean, fundamental questions, and we do not know.
So this is super interesting. I'm curious within those questions that you just asked, those are like when you were describing the application of seed balls, and there was a question of scale, and it's like absolutely it scales. But for these soil microbial communities, if you're trying to scale them up or spread them or improve soil health, it sounds like it's a lot tougher challenge and more labor intensive and a lot more unknowns. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I mean, so soil microbial ecologists have an idea of how microbes move, but we have I happen to be married to a microbial ecologist. And if I take a clump of soil and put it somewhere and I ask him, how long will it take for the community here to move through the soil and develop and grow to be the same community a meter away? He's like, nobody knows that. Nobody knows that. And obviously there's a lot of environmental variables that would modify it, but nobody knows. Nobody knows. I mean, there's no information on this. So one of the things we've looked at is taking healthy soil and trying to mix it into the seed balls so that you can inoculate basically where your degraded areas through the application of seed balls. But again, we have no idea how much. We don't want to destroy an intact area to take like 7 tons of soil but how much soil do you need to inoculate 400 acres? I don't know. You could take a spoonful of soil and like grow it in a lab and cultivate it and try to expand and increase those bacterial and fungal groups that are really good. But nobody knows how much you need or how fast it'll grow. I mean, there's so many unknowns. So actually, I've been trying for the last year to get money to try to address some of these basic questions of space, because there's also all these questions about like spatial distribution and how things grow, and nobody knows. And so but every time I apply, I get to like basically the last level and everyone's like, this is awesome, this is novel. But because we have no idea if your study will work, we're not going to give you money because you have to do some preliminary data. So it's like so novel because nobody's done this kind of experimental work. Again, like how our knowledge of how things move, how microbes move is mostly based on lab work, right? But we're talking about the field. So, my experiment, essentially, I'm asking like, okay, if I inoculate in big amounts or small amounts, or in one clump or several clumps, and then following through time, the communities away from that inoculation, how much does it move? People are like, great question, but we don't think this is going to work because nobody's ever done this before. So we're not going to give you money. I mean, you would think it's like a basic question, but no, because it's marrying this idea of like basic microbial ecology or biology, how things move with kind of management. And that isn't done almost ever. And one of the reasons I am in it is because I happen to be married to someone who does something very, very different. And so we can talk about it, but this like true interdisciplinary collaboration that's needed to address some of these questions, it's really hard to find, because like, how do you know who you even need to talk to about this kind of thing? And most people who study, basic ecology are not interested in management. So these questions are not of interest to them.
Well, so is that characteristic of research funding that you need like a quick application for your research to be justified for funding, or you need to have a something that you will be able to apply your research to fairly shortly after you've done the research? Is that
I don't think it's necessarily quick application. I think you have to show a clear need, which I'm able to do because I work with a lot of managers. And you have to show clearly how the information you're going to get will address that need, which I think I also do that. The problem is this work is very, very expensive because you have to do a lot of sequencing. So I'm not asking for like $30,000. I'm asking for like $500,000. And these funding agencies are reticent to give me $500,000 for something that they don't know is going to work. And so they want to see a little bit of preliminary data to at least know that the money they're going to invest, something should come out, as opposed to, we have no idea. I mean, if you inoculate here and you follow for 5 years 30 centimeters away, there's a possibility that 30 centimeters away you will never get a signal of what you inoculated. Maybe, I don't know. You would hope so, because people are inoculating all over with the expectation that things kind of grow and expand through the soil, but we have no idea.
well, this may be a question that's beyond, or it's definitely a question that's beyond restoration ecology, but how do you think about like the notion that we need to fund research that might not be fruitful right away, like the breakthrough ideas that would get us from where you're talking about to 10 years into the future where we know all the answers to what you're describing, I would assume would be funding those things that don't have obvious answers right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think we should be funding both, right? I think there are some like extremely pressing challenges that need some answer immediately. But then there are things that are going to take longer to do a better job to find an answer for. So I think the funding should be both. And I mean, the government was, hopefully will continue to, doing kind of both of those things. I operate in a world of very, very applied funding. And so USDA, mostly USDA, but USDA has lots of different places where they fund. And USDA really wants to fund research that's directly applicable for enhancing the livelihoods of people in the United States. So mostly ranchers and farmers, but other people as well. And so they would fund things that have very quick turnarounds, which is great. But then I've had things funded that were much more like, we're going to test a bunch of different approaches to enhance long-term drought resilience, for example. And those are things that take many, many years and will take many, many experiments. And those have been funded. So that's great. But you need both, really. And really the short-term stuff, not only does it maybe slightly solve an immediate problem or contribute to solving an immediate problem, but then you can leverage what you learn on those short term to devise larger and more comprehensive experiments, right? I mean, science builds on itself. So you need both, I think.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned drought resilience. I wonder if we can switch gears a little bit to talk about climate adaptation,
Yeah.
and like the things that um, like one is kind of thinking about how are we doing right now, and then what should we be thinking about doing in terms of climate adaptation?
Ugh. Um, so it's getting drier and it will continue to get drier. And so trying to solve challenges associated with degradation without considering resilience for the future is not going to work, because you might solve it for this year, but it's going to get worse and worse and worse. And so we need to be thinking about drought resilience in the sense of what can we be doing that will allow people to farm and ranch and live and garden and hike and do all these things, while also protecting for the inevitable drier future. Okay. And that's a really hard thing to answer because it's a novelty, right? The climate has always been changing, but we are now in a novel climate environment where it's just drier than it's ever been. It will continue to get drier. So we're in these like no climate analogs. And novel situations require novel approaches to solve them. But a lot of the people that are working on these things, government or older researchers, novelty is not, that scares them because you're trying stuff that's never been done before, or you're trying stuff that has only been tested in one experiment or whatever. So for example, something that I've been trying to work on is as it gets, so from the beginning of this talk, I mentioned restoration. You try to get a system that's been damaged back to the way it was before. But what if it's been drought that has disturbed a system? You've had successive years of drought, everything dies. So all those plants have died because they are not tolerant of successive years of drought. But we know that in the future, drought will continue to occur in successive years. So why would you plant the plants that you lost that died because they can't tolerate those conditions? And you know those conditions are going to continue. So some people, myself included, are not restoration purists in the sense of, I think we should be thinking about planting maybe natives, but varieties that are from drier areas, right? So this is not putting back what was there before. This is trying to have an analog to what was there before, but that's more resilient to drought. And when you talk about this to people, a lot of people are like, that makes sense. You would want to put in things that might be more tolerant. So for us in the Sonoran Desert, it's things, and in Tucson, I'm in Tucson, you know, things from maybe 100 miles south of here. These are species, so that they're the same species, but they're varieties that are from Mexico. They might be more tolerant of those dry land. So some people I talk to and they're like, that makes sense. When I talk to government about this, they're like, absolutely not. They've had rules on the books since forever that you can only plant things from within 30 miles and blah, blah, blah. You know, there are all these regulations and rules. And restoration purists would say, I'm not doing restoration. I'm putting non-native things in the system. So people are, you know, resistant to change. That's the way people are. But we have to try new things because it's an emergency. It's an emergency. And so I'm very into trying new things on smaller scales. You know, this is not trying things on thousands of acres of public land, but focusing, I think we should be focusing funding and experimentation and management on trying these new technologies that might address these new challenges.
So you mentioned like analog as a potential replacement or alternative to native plants. In the case of like buffalo grass, you're the constraint of using native plants is a self-imposed constraint that we as a society put on ourselves, right? We could be trying completely different plants from completely
Yes.
different areas
Yeah.
to potentially solve the problem, but we have decided that native plants are the only ones that, of all the portfolio of plants that we have to
Well,
try.
and also how we define native plants. I mean, there are certain arms of the government, for example, that the native plant, it's native, it's a native species, and native, the variety. So it's native to that area. While I would say if it's the same species, but the variety is from a different place, I don't necessarily consider that a non-native, but it's not as native as, you know, what, and there are regulations that have been put in place for very good reason, and rules about what can be used so people aren't just doing things willy-nilly. But a lot of these rules were put in place, you know, in the 50s or the 60s, and things are different now. And so, yeah, I think we need to be considering more novel strategies.
Well, so you mentioned like the good reasons to not do or the good reasons that those regulations were put in place. What are the reasons that you as someone who's not a plant expert, what are the reasons that we don't want to put native plants or non-native plants into new places?
That's a great question because we never know what they're going to do.
Hmm.
I mean, some of our major invasives like tamarisk and bufflegrass were put here by the United States government. They were put here for a very good reason. Okay, people were dying in the Dust Bowl. We need to feed cattle so it could feed people. We needed a plant that could survive. So, you know, bufflegrass several versions of buffalo grass were actually introduced, and finally the one that there was a variety that worked better. But and tamarisk was used to, you know, create these riparian areas that the bank stayed, because tamarisk grows really fast and great. But these are plants that are now some of our most noxious invaders, and so people are afraid of moving things where they weren't, because we never know what's going to happen, and it could be that something worse happens, you know, or we could move accidentally, like some smut or rust or some microbe associated with a plant that we don't even know about, and we bring it into the, you know, the Sonoran Desert to take care of buffalo grass, and then this microbial thing kills off all of our native plants. Like, we don't know.
Mm.
So it takes years and years and years of testing for these things. And I understand why that is, but we don't have years anymore.
Yeah.
We don't.
And so you mentioned buffalo grass was introduced as a response, or at least in part as a response to the Dust Bowl.
Mm-hmm.
Is the I don't know if you call it a case study, or the case of buffalo grass, that for that time it solved the problem. It was a success,
Yep.
that when it
Yep. I mean, it's still being planted in Mexico
oh wow, okay.
because it's a fairly hardy, drought tolerant forage grass. I mean, you know,
Yeah.
so if you're in a really dry area and you don't have irrigation and you want to make sure your cows have something to eat, you might plant it.
But when it was planted, or when it was introduced, was it like an educated guess? I mean, I assume the science has come much further since then, that we would be able to make a pretty good educated guess on what would be like the thing to.
Well, because it doesn't, usually you look at how something operates in its native habitat, and buffalo grass, like basically all of our non-natives here, doesn't grow the way it grows here in
Mm.
its native habitat. And so my husband's from Spain, we're in Europe a lot, and it's funny because I'll see some of our non-natives that grow in like these huge monocultures across acres, and you'll be in Spain and there's like one individual. And I've never in the US seen one individual. So back in the day, you know, the government was like, okay, this is how this grows here. It's similar climate, similar. There's no reason to expect why this grass would go out of control here. It does, you know?
Well,
Yeah.
um,
And I mean, given not every, you know, lots of things try to get in all the time. There's things moving around all the time. And most things don't become invasive. There's this rule that it's like of every 10 species that gets introduced, one is able to survive, and of those 10, like one is able to grow, and of those 10, like one becomes invasive. So it's some law, I forgot the name of it, but so most things don't become invasive. And that, I think, back in the 50s was kind of, it wasn't just like a pray, let's pray this doesn't work, but you know, you take a look at how the plant does in its native habitat, and you say, okay, well, this is how it's doing. We're going to hope, you know, and that was an emergency. I mean, people were dying, but you never know. You don't know what it is. There's all these hypotheses of why things become invasive. They're released from, you know, maybe there's some bug in South Africa that eats the buffalo grass enough, and that bug doesn't live here, and now it goes crazy. Or maybe there's one competitor there that outcompetes it, or something. I mean, you never know. It's really, really hard to know because ecology is so complex.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, in the context of climate change, I've heard pretty massive scale ideas thrown around, like for like the water problem, thinking about desalination, for
Yeah.
bigger climate problems, thinking about geoengineering.
Mm-hmm.
Would maybe a slightly smaller scale be just putting a ton of money into researching soil health and native and non-native plants, and how we could potentially, I mean, you described the drought future as pretty certain.
Bleak.
Yeah, yeah. Is there a way to make it not so certain, or not so bleak,
Um,
by like
well, I
allocate
don't
some
think at this
resources?
point, I don't think we can, unless we stop doing everything we're doing right now, and it would still be like a 50-year thing. So I think drought is going to be part of the landscape. What I think we might be able to do is mitigate the effects of drought. And so, sure, I obviously, as a researcher in this field, I think there should be more money for it. But I think also there needs to be more resources directed at community groups and individuals who can do things like, so for example, in Tucson where I live, there are rebates available for people who install water barrels or basins in their homes. And so if you buy a $150 water barrel, or you have someone come in and make basins, which holds on to water, the city will give you, I don't know if they do it anymore, but they used to give you like a rebate for that. So you get some money back. I think there needs to be action at every level. So at the home level, people need to get rebates for like using their gray water, or should get free native trees from the city or whatever. And then at the city level, the city should be funding more native parks and shade structures, and using gray water for golf courses, or getting rid of golf courses in general. At the state level, so I think there needs to be something everywhere, because it's coming and there's only so much water. I think people forget desalination works if you're on a coast. If you are inland, desalination is not going to work, because desalination works, but moving water is very, very, very expensive. So we know how to do desalination. It happens. And I mean, it's not the best thing, because it gets things dirty and whatever. But how are you going to get water from the Pacific coast into Michigan? Well, maybe not Michigan, Kentucky.
Right.
You're gonna like pay for trucks to truck it. I mean, it's not, that's not how it's gonna work. So things have to happen at all levels so that people are more prepared for less water. Okay. I mean, I think seriously, in like 20 years, I don't know if Tucson's going to have water to support anything now. I know in Phoenix, in Arizona now, there's a rule that if you are building houses, you have to show, we're getting into an area I don't know that much about, but I think you have to like demonstrate that you have access to at least 20 or 50 years of water. And it can't be from the Colorado River where we're all getting water, right? And so it's like, where's this water coming from that's going to support all these people? Like, there's a finite amount of water there. I think 2% of the water on Earth is fresh water, and most of it is locked up in ice. And most of that ice is going to melt into the ocean. So there's not that much water around, and less is coming. So like, how do we deal with this water? Maybe there's a thing with like water cleaning stations at people's houses. I don't know, but there needs to be more money diverted to empowering individuals and communities to deploy things that are going to mitigate the effects, because the effects are here and we can't really do much about drought in general.
Well, just as kind of a question to kind of wrap up and summarize some of the concepts that we've talked about, could you humor me and imagine that you're talking to a future funder or policymaker? What kinds of things would you advise them to do and fund? I know you kind of spoke to this just a second ago about the different levels of policymaking, but we've talked about seed balls, addressing buffalo grass, talking about soil microbial communities. What are some of the mechanisms that you would encourage future leaders and policymakers to get behind?
Yeah, I think there should be more money directed towards environmental efforts, in the sense of getting native plants on the ground and keeping them there. And with the inevitable development of adding more parking lots and houses and all that, that's not going to stop. But creating more rules associated with kind of the materials you can use, and people being allowed to drive electric cars versus non-electric, or things like that. I mean, there needs to be more money allocated towards making sure that inevitable development is done in the most green way possible. And this can be really good for business. I mean, I try to not take on this hippie thing of like, everyone should just stop eating meat and we can't build any more houses, because that's just not reasonable, I think, or it's not feasible, and it's not going to happen. So if we really consider how people are going to be, and that means we're going to continue building houses, we're going to continue developing areas, we're going to continue living in a desert that cannot support all these people, there should be money allocated to making these areas more resilient to the inevitable future. And some of this is like, people should care about buffalo grass, because there's buffalo grass growing around homes. And if there's a fire, you might die. Like these are not small things. So how do you deal with buffalo grass and having defensible space and planting natives around your house? Like, why aren't there free classes or money or free trees or something like that? I don't know. I mean, I know money is not endless, but I feel like some of the things I see money going towards, I think it would be better allocated to environmental purposes that maintain our ability to live where we're living. I pay a mortgage. I want to be able to like continue living here. I don't want in 20 years to have to move because there's no more water. So I would be willing to pay more taxes to make that a reality, but that's just me.
Well, Elise, thank you so much for taking the time to share your insights and wisdom, and hope we can continue the conversation down the road.
Yeah, thanks. Hope that wasn't too much of a bummer.
Oh, that's good.